All right, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and kick things off. It is a little bit after 3, so we'll go ahead and start our Champlain Valley Petal Fall thinning meeting. We're going to go ahead and start out. I'm going to go through just some of my observations from earlier today, just kind of set the scene for what I've been seeing around Peru and the Champlain Valley at large. And then we'll turn things over to Terrence to get his suggestions about how we can manage through our petal fall thinning period during this week. So with that, as I mentioned, I was out in the Peru area today and obviously spent a lot of time in the Champlain Valley looking around at the blossoms this time of year. So just commenting first and foremost about the return bloom that we've been seeing around the area. And overall, it is fairly variable again this year, really depending a lot on the particular variety. So I'm going to talk about some of the different varieties that we've been looking at that are really the ones that we'd like to pay close attention to. So looking at Honeycrisp, of course, is variable depending on the farm and the block within each farm. Some are very on this year. Some are fairly off as well. So it's important to really get a good look and know how your blocks are looking. And then within a few blocks as well, as I see a lot with Honeycrisp, we can have trees that are very on, trees that are very off, things kind of going back and forth between different panels. So I would say for the most part, though, there are a good amount of blocks that are fairly on this year that are going to need some thinning, but definitely going through block by block, seeing what's on and what might be more off, where you might want to skip over some of the thinner applications this season. Looking at Fuji, I looked at a block of September Wonder and a block of Aztec Fuji this morning. Both of those two blocks are very much in an on year, I would say. For the most part, the trees within those blocks are very much on and are going to need some thinning attention this season. Looking at our New York One or our Snapdragons, again, for the most part, a lot of on blocks across the Champlain Valley this year. A few lighter blocks can be found here and there, but through all the New York One that I've been looking at, I would say for the most part, very on again this year. And McCown that I looked at are also very on as well. That being said, there are a couple of blocks that I found that are off, and also on some other varieties where I don't typically tend to see or expect a lot of return bloom issues. So looking at a couple of blocks of Gala in particular really surprised me. Also a few blocks of Pink Lady, and then also a few blocks of Wild Twist, were a bit lighter than I would have expected them to be. And I think that does match up fairly well with some of the patterns that we saw in 2023, where we had a little bit more significant frost injury in a couple of areas. So I think we are seeing some layering effects overall of that situation from 23. And so we're in that off cycle again from that frost that we had. So with all that in consideration, where we do have return bloom, looking at the individual flower clusters themselves, I would say for the most part, from what I've been seeing and matching up with the weather patterns that we had this past winter and through the spring, overall looks like there's very minimal flower damage to the clusters. Maybe a few short kings here and there on a couple of low spots. I've noticed it in a few New York One, a few McCounts here and there, really just in some low pockets. But I think this is a very, very minimal percentage of the flowers that I've been looking at over the past week or so. So I think overall, in blocks that are on, flower quality looks to be fairly good going into this petal fall window. Luckily for the Champlain Valley, I think we've had really excellent pollination weather. We had a really short, really warm bloom, a lot of sunny days, really good bee flight, and I think that's really starting to show up already in the clusters that I've looked at today. You can see a couple of Honeycrisp and some Gala clusters that I've looked at. I think we're already really starting to see things starting to set up. I'm seeing good growth in a couple of the kings already, and a number of the laterals as well are starting to swell. They're starting to hook upward. So it looks to me like we should be looking at a fairly nice set overall in the Champlain Valley. I do think too, it's probably a little bit early to tell overall, but I think where we had used some ATS last week, for those of you that were using it for some bloom thinning, it does look like we probably did get some fruit set reduction from using that material. I think things have set up a little bit less strongly there, but that's what we were hoping to achieve with those applications. Again, we had nice, warm, sunny weather last week, so where those applications went on, I think they were really effective. I think we still want to give those fruitlets a few more days so we can get a better sense overall how they're growing and how they're setting up to really see the full extent of that thinner application. But I do think I am seeing a few differences between blocks that have and haven't used it this year. So in terms of where we are at in fruit size, pretty much all the kings that I've looked at today across all varieties are pretty much between 3 and 5 millimeters at this point. Max and McCown's a little bit further along. We do still have some petals out in things like Honeycrisp, and certainly quite a good amount of petals still on the trees in our New York 1. So I think overall, we probably still have a few days before we're really into that peak window of that petal fall thinning sweet spot that Terrence will be talking about momentarily here. And I think with that, we're moving slowly through this window. We do have these really cool temperatures and certainly feels very cool compared to the weather we had last week. But looking at the forecast for most of the week, cool, drizzly conditions are probably going to make it a long window and also a difficult window for us to get these thinner applications on. With the limited activity from the weather, it's going to be tough to get a lot of activity out of our PGR thinners. Certainly Maxell, I assume, is going to be off the table for us if we're barely cracking 60 degrees, and also probably so for NAA and NAD. I'm guessing Terrence will be telling us to lean more heavily on carbo for this application, but I won't get ahead of myself. I'll turn things over to the expert. So with that, Terrence, if you'd like to share your screen and take it on from here, turn things over to you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Well, it's good to be with everybody, and it's great to be talking about thinning. And I'll just start by saying it's a good news and a bad news situation. The bad news is the temperatures that we're going to have for the petal fall thinning window are terrible. And there's just no way around it because the long-term forecast, at least for 7 days, are temperatures in the 50s. I hope that you will have taken advantage of the opportunity to spray something during bloom, because I will remind you that we're in a sequence of sprays. Right now, we're going to talk about the petal fall spray. And for this, we rely heavily on the carbon balance model and on a particular fruit size, which we arrive at around 110 to 130 days after bloom. We're not quite there yet. That's generally when fruits are 5 to 6 millimeters. But it's a terrible window, and I don't think we're going to get the thinning that we need from this particular window. So we really hope that you got something on during bloom and that worked, and that we'll be able to come back in another week or so for another meeting to talk about the main money spray, the 10 to 13 millimeter spray. But even looking forward to that, if the forecast holds, it's going to be in mid 60s for that spray, not up into the 75 to 80, which we prefer to get good thinning response. Now, I realize forecasts can change, but at the moment, it looks like it's going to be a difficult thinning year. So that's the bad news. Now on to maybe some possible ideas on how to deal with this particular year. So I think it's set up to be an excellent year in terms of fruit set and crop. We didn't bloom too early. We had pretty cool temperatures between green tip and pink. But since pink, temperatures have been in the moderate in mid 60s to low 70s uh, up until bloom, and then we rushed through it in a 7 day period. Now, you guys in the Champlain were lucky that your bloom didn't coincide with day after day after day of rain. So in Western New York, and to some extent in the Capital District, the very poor weather during bloom has resulted in some kings not setting because of no bee flight. But I expected in the Champlain, you'll have excellent initial set. As Mike has indicated, we've got mostly pretty good bloom. Well, the big deal is no frost so far this year. And looking at the forecast, it doesn't show any frost headed your way. So it really indicates that we need strong thinning, but it's going to be difficult to achieve strong thinning with these low temperatures. I ran the carbohydrate model for Peru this morning, and it shows that we've basically had a carbohydrate deficit ever since green tip. Mike indicated that possibly Mac full bloom was on the 13th, maybe Honeycrisp was a couple days later on the 15th. But for this case, I put it on the 13th, and you'll see that the temperatures we had during bloom, relatively high, gave us significant carbohydrate deficits during bloom. That's not a big concern to me because we think that up through bloom, the tree still has reserves to draw upon. But once we get to petal fall, then the tree really doesn't use reserves and depends on daily carbohydrate supply. So as we move forward on this curve to today, which is the next to the last dot, and tomorrow, which is forecasted, we're coming back up to basically a neutral carbohydrate balance situation where there's no deficit. But if we look forward, I'm predicting that the whole week will have a positive carbohydrate balance, which will mean minimal thinning from our thinning sprays. So this summary of this slide is that no carbohydrate deficit in the next few days will make petal fall thinning a challenge. Now, I wanted to focus for a few minutes on exactly the kinds of things we can expect in the next 7 days at Peru. On this chart is just a table from the carbohydrate model showing that the last several days, 17th, 18th, and then today, the 19th, our temperatures were 60s and higher. And we had some daily negative carbohydrate balance. And even the 6-day average had a pretty decent carbohydrate balance. Now, if you would have sprayed then, you probably would have got more response. But in the next to the last column, you see the degree days since bloom were still low, meaning the fruits were still too small. Now, by that, I mean that when fruits are in the beginning of petal fall, they're 4 millimeters, and then they grow slowly to 5 millimeters. They're growing so slow that thinners have minimal response. So we did this 17-year study where I sprayed right at 4 millimeters, and then 3 days later, I sprayed at 5 to 6 millimeters. We almost never got good thinning when we sprayed at 4 millimeters, but often we would get pretty decent thinning at 5 to 6 millimeters. That's why we have now been recommending that you wait to put on your petal fall thinner spray until you accumulate 100-degree days after bloom. And that's going to be on basically May 21st, May 22nd. So we're not even there yet. So if you went out to spray today, you'd still be on the early side and would get minimal response. But starting on Wednesday, or maybe Thursday, the window in terms of fruit size will be achieved. But you look in the first two columns, temperatures in the mid to low 50s, nighttime temperatures in the 40s, but the solar radiation is also very low. A high radiation is around 30. Anything less than 15 is pretty dark. But you'll see that because it's so cold, the fruits will be growing very slowly. The daily carbohydrate balance is going to be positive. That will be a problem in that we won't get any response out of our thinners. In fact, I think that it's almost going to be a waste of money to put any NAA or NAD on during this window of between 100-degree days and 130, which will probably start on Wednesday, Thursday, and go through Sunday. So the basic summary, I wanted to just put it in 2 bulleted points. This year, daytime temperatures are going to be very cold and relatively low light levels. This will result in poor petal fall thinning. Now, I've said that negative comment so many times, it's just kind of depressing to think about the problem. The problem is that particularly for Honeycrisp, we learned this pretty much doing thinning work up at Shazy Orchards with Gary for many years, if we don't get significant thinning at bloom and petal fall on Honeycrisp, we almost always have biennial bearing. So I just can't stomach the idea that this weather is going to force us into a problem of next year having low return bloom on Honeycrisp. I don't know all the answers, but I'm going to give you some possible ideas. I want to review what sort of a season-long thinning program for both Honeycrisp and Gala would look like. Now, this year we've suggested using lime sulfur instead of ATS, but if you use ATS, that's great. Hopefully you got some response from that. And I liked what I heard from Mike, that he thought that he was seeing maybe a little response. That would be fantastic. But right now we're talking about, for Honeycrisp, this petal fall spray of 4 ounces of NAA and a pint of 7. Now, remember, we still have the ability to come back when fruits are bigger and another NA and 7. And if we need to, when fruits are even bigger, and exceed and Maxell with fruits are 16 millimeters. But I worry that we may not have good conditions at those timings as well. Now, with Gala, we recommend something slightly different. We typically like Maxell and 7 at petal fall, but this year it's so cold, it would be a waste of your money to put Maxell on this timing. So what can we do? Well, I think the best thing we can try to do is time this near the end of the window, which will be Saturday or Sunday. So I've highlighted that in point number 2. You can read the rest of the text on your own. So waiting until Saturday and Sunday, because it's forecasted that on Monday we'll get into the low 60s and Tuesday into the mid 60s. Now that's a lot better than mid 50s. But the last 2 points I've highlighted is that in a year like this, when there is a surplus of carbohydrates, according to the carbohydrate model, we'd like you to put regulate in the tank, especially if you put NAA in the tank. But probably the better and simpler strategy is point number 5. Just put on 7, but the high rate of 7, the 2 pints per 100 gallons, and then depend on a little bit of moisture and rain to re-wet that 7 and give us some continual thinning. Now, this strategy could be done even earlier than Saturday or Sunday. So you could come in on Wednesday and put some 7 on, 2 pints, and then hope you get some re-wetting, and then come back in another, say, Monday and put more 7 on. It won't be perfect, but if you get a little bit of dew or a little bit of rain and it re-wets the 7, you might get a little more thinning. But it's probably the best we can do. If you want to throw NAA in the tank to feel good, that's fine with me, but I think it will get almost no response from the NAA. So that's kind of my basic message. I wish it was a more positive note. I do want to emphasize, if you don't do anything at petal fall, you'll probably condemn yourself to have biennial bearing on Honeycrisp, Snapdragon, probably those 2, and Fuji. So I think you've got to do something, even though we have a very cold week. Now, if you decide to put some NA in the tank, and I don't say you shouldn't do that, put some Regulate with it, but also probably assume you won't get anything out of it. But if you put some in, then I want to review how you should calculate how much goes in the tank. For chemical thinners, as opposed to fungicides and insecticides, we have to pay attention to how much chemical gets on the leaf, because it's the micrograms of chemical that the leaf gets and absorbs that determine the response. Whereas with an insecticide or fungicide, you're just trying to coat the leaf. And it doesn't really matter if you coat it heavier or a little bit lighter, as long as there's a coating. But with PGRs, the way we account for this is by calculating the concentration factor. And that starts by calculating the tree roll volume of each block, and then dividing that by the volume of spray that you're going to use with your particular setup. Now, let's suppose that a relatively big semi-dwarf or tall spindle would measure 200 gallons of tree roll volume dilute spray. And by the way, the formula to calculate tree roll volume is all over the Cornell recommends on the thinning sections. And then let's assume it calculates at 200, but you're not carrying 200 gallons of water, you're only carrying 100. So the 200 divided by 100 gives you a factor of 2. That means that when you mix it up, you got to multiply it by 2. Now, I've been suggesting 4 ounces of NaA at Petal Fall, although this year I don't think it will do much thinning. But multiply that by the factor of 2, that gives 8 ounces of NaA in every 100 gallons. And then you have 500-gallon tank, so you multiply that by 5. That means you put 40 ounces of NaA in the sprayer tank. So that's an important calculation that you do for each block. For example, let's suppose you have a younger, more narrowly planted tall spindle that only measures 150 gallons. And in that case, let's suppose that you're still spraying 100 gallons of water. In that case, the concentration factor is the 150 divided by 100, it's 1.5. So you would take that 4 ounces that I recommend, multiply it by 1.5, which would be 6 ounces of NA, times 5 for the 500 gallons of the sprayer, you'd end up with 30 ounces in the spray tank. Another thing you can do is just spray less water. If you have 150-gallon trees, suppose you just sprayed 75 gallons, then you still have a concentration factor of 2, and you'd still be putting 40 ounces in the spray tank. But in that case, the sprayer of 500 gallons would be spraying close to 7 acres instead of 5 acres. So that 40 ounces would be spread over 7 acres. So this calculation is critical for either NAA or Carbaryl or NAA or Maxell. If you are simply using Carbaryl and you're not putting any NA in the tank, then you just put this high dose, 2 pints per 100. So in a 500-gallon sprayer, you're putting 10 pints in that 500-gallon sprayer and just going to spray it. Because only a limited amount is going to be absorbed by the leaf. The rest is going to be deposited as an insecticide on the surface of the leaf. And by the way, it does a great job against plum curculio. But as little bits of rain come in the next few days, it will re-wet and reabsorb that Carbaryl and give you more thinning. Now, I'll just end that part of the discussion by saying Carbaryl is an effective thinner at lower temperatures than is NAA or Maxell. So I expect it to do some thinning even in the 50 degrees. Now, the last thing I want to encourage you to do is somebody in the Champlain, and maybe several of you, should measure fruitlets and use a fruit growth rate model. And that's where you tag 15 spurs on each of 5 trees, measure their diameters at 3 or 4 days after spraying and 7 to 10 days after spraying, and enter the data in the Malusim phone app that we have. And that will tell you how many fruits you've thinned off with your bloom and petal fall spray. Now that data will be essential as we come up later in a week or week and a half on the normal 10 to 12 millimeter spray. Because if at that time you've not accomplished hardly any thinning, then it will really guide how aggressive we're going to be then, given the temperatures we're going to have in that window. If, however, you were lucky and the bloom thinners really worked, and this application of 7 kind of works, you might not need such an aggressive thinning dose at that time. I'll end with just this slide as we think about Honeycrisp. This particular one at Petal Fall is a critical one to get repeat bloom, as well as the bloom that we've already just passed. The upcoming sprays at 10 to 12 and 15 to 18 millimeters can help thinning, but they often don't give the repeat bloom that we want. To get repeat bloom, we switch to weekly ethereal sprays, starting when fruits are about 16 millimeters. And that has worked quite well to give us good repeat bloom. Now, Mike did a study with Adam Sullivan last year, and it did work. It wasn't perfect, but this approach gave relatively good return bloom. With that sort of negative presentation, I'll stop and be happy to discuss it and take questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Terrence. Wish we had better news to give, but we appreciate the insights all the same. I do see a few questions that came in through the chat box. I'll go ahead and start on those, but feel free to continue typing them in or asking Terrence directly. Uh, Jim had asked, can we use Li 700 in place of Regulate as our
Yes.
surfactant?
Yeah, Regulate is the one that we've tested the most, but Li 700 will accomplish the same thing.
Okay, great. What would be your recommendation for Cortlands? We know in previous years that we don't like to put 7 on Cortland, so what would you recommend in this case?
So with Cortland, since it's a tip bearer, we're not so concerned about return bloom. I'd just wait it out, wait this cold weather out and thin at the bigger fruit size, 10 to 12, 13 millimeters with our NAA at that timing. So I wouldn't put anything on Cortlands right now. Now, it would have been great if we had thinned Cortlands with some ATS at bloom, but I would just not do anything right now.
All right. Particular recommendations, Petal Fall Thinning Spray on Max, Sweet Tango, and Wild Twist.
So Max is relatively easy to thin variety, as well as is Wild Twist. Now, Sweet Tango, I'm going to put off for just a sec because it's a special case. But with Macintosh and Wild Twist, I'd put some carbaryl on them right now. Hope we got something, and then just a mild dose at the later timing of 5 parts of NAA plus another pint of 7, sometime late next week, I'm guessing. Now, Sweet Tango is an unusual case in that there are 2 varieties that we've looked at that tend to produce natural ethylene around petal fall. One of them is Sweet Tango, and the other one is Evercrisp. And I talked about Evercrisp at the recent in-depth fruit school we had in March in Syracuse. If you didn't attend that particular school, what I said there is that the natural ethylene that is produced by Sweet Tango and by Wild Twist gives natural thinning. It's as if you would put on some seed or ethyl on them. They naturally have that ethylene production within the flowers and they thin very easy. That's why so many people have overthinned Evercrisp. So for Sweet Tango, what we suggest is no thinner at bloom, no thinner at petal fall, and then a very light dose of thinner at the 10 to 12 millimeters. After you can really see that the fruits made it through that natural ethylene and they're not in the process of falling off. So for Sweet Tango, I like to delay as far as I can, get it up to 13 millimeters, make sure they're really there, and then put on a light dose. So I think this cold weather, you just wait it out with those 2 varieties, Sweet Tango and Evercrisp. I didn't specifically say with Evercrisp, but I don't ever want to thin it at bloom or at petal fall. I just want to wait and put on a very light dose, maybe just some carbaryl at the 10 to 12 millimeter stage.
Okay, great. Thank you, Terrence. So just to review, Sweet Tango, Wild Twist, and Evercrisp, go ahead and just wait it out since they're going to naturally be a little bit easier to thin anyways.
Well, Wild Twist you put in there, but I didn't put it in there. Wild Twist, I'd like to get some carbaryl on it right now.
Okay,
It's just Sweet Tango and Evercrisp.
got it. Okay, thank you. With another question from Jim. So carbaryl not concentrated by the concentration factor. So just 2 pints per 100 gallons, regardless of tree size.
Yeah, the reason we don't calculate that concentration for carbaryl is because of the solubility problem. It's soluble in whatever amount of water at the rate of 1 pint per 100. And if you exceed that, the extra amount that you put in, let's say the second pint, is not in solution. That second pint is just being mixed by the sprayer, kept in suspension. But when it lands on the leaf, only the part of the 7 that's in solution, the first pint, can be absorbed by the plant. The rest just dries on the leaf and forms a nice insecticide layer against plum curculio. And so in most years, it's a waste of time to put on that second pint or concentrate the 7. But in a year where we're not going to get any decent thinning, it maybe is a good idea because we've had this weather system of a little bit of rain, light rains, more little bit of rain, light rains repeatedly. And I expect it to continue this week. And so carbaryl will be re-wetted. And that extra amount that's on the leaf, when it's re-wetted, then more of that can be absorbed. And so you'll get more thinning.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do you have a sense if we have these multiple rewetting events, how long would you expect for us to really get a sense of how much thinning we get from that? Will it be sometime next week
Yeah.
ahead of that 12 millimeter thinner, or will it be a little bit more delayed? Do you expect?
That's the problem. It's hard to see that full effect of the second pint of 7 when you have to decide what to put on next because it's a delayed, drawn out process, probably 10 days. Maybe because of the cool weather, we won't be trying to spray a 10 millimeter spray for 10 days. But even then, unless you're measuring fruit diameters and using the fruit growth rate model, you won't really be able to tell completely what you got out of the 2 pints of 7. That's why I really would love to see several of you measure, put on the 2 pints of 7, let's say Wednesday or Thursday, measure the first measurement on Monday and then the following measurement on Thursday of next week. And then you would know by Friday, Saturday of next week how much thinning you got out of that carb row. And it would really guide what you do after that. Because I don't think you'll be able to see the results until the mid following week.
All right. Well, that's good to know. Thank you. Are there any other questions for Terrence before we go ahead and conclude the meeting? I
Hey,
hear someone.
Mike.
Yep.
Mike. Hey, it's John Clements over here in the Banana Belt.
Hey, John.
Sorry to hijack this slightly, but I'm just curious if Terrence thinks almost everything he said about this petal fall thinning window applies to our current 10 millimeter window. You don't have to be lengthy, Terrence. I'm just curious if most of it applies. We're stuck between a rock and a hard place right now.
Well, I agree with you 100%, John. It is not a good situation. And unfortunately, I'm not that magical to make it better. But I do think that if you can wait till the later end of that window, so we'd normally say to wait till the 200 to 250 degree days, wait till the 250, and then put something on and hopefully relatively high rates with regulate.
Yeah, we'll be at we'll be at 250 like later this weekend. So hopefully the weather will square away by then. All right, I don't want to hijack your meeting.
All good, John. We're starting to think these questions through for the capital region too. So
Yeah,
I hear
be
you.
there. You'll be there in another week.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, the weather doesn't always cooperate, does it?
This is
No, it
really a
does not.
difficult year for thinning.
Yeah, we had 2 or 3 days of good pollination weather, then it rained for 4 days straight. So it seems like things are all over the place. Anyhow, thank you.
Sure thing.
I have one more question about the 2 pints of carbaryl. Would that be enough, do you think, to be a petal fall insecticide spray without any additional insecticide?
Absolutely, but maybe not. I'm going to hedge because Peter Jentz and I, it's more than a decade ago, looked at that. And in the Hudson Valley orchards that we were working in, he got excellent control of plum curcula with a 2 pint rate. But I don't want to stick my neck out and say that, yes, you don't have to put a different insecticide. I'd go ahead with your regular insecticide, even though we know you get a lot of control out of that second pint of 7 on the leaf.
I won't be calling you, don't worry.
Okay.
Of what we do. Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah.
All
Yeah,
right, folks.
that
Anything else?
study on plum curcula we published in the Fruit Quarterly way back when, but it basically gave really good plum curcula control.
All right, good to know. All right, not hearing anything else. I'm going to take another look through the chat box here. Some people did NAA for their bloom thinner. Only regulate on Gala or all. So would you do the regulate on everything or just on the hard to thin stuff like Gala?
Well, let me first try to address Jesse's comment that he went for NAA at full bloom instead of the caustic ones of ATS or lime sulfur. It should work fairly well for you because you had nice temperatures at bloom. Now, what happens with NAA? It knocks out some of the seeds, but it doesn't thin off many apples. They seem to hang on. But the fact that you've knocked some seeds out means that you've helped yourself in terms of return bloom with Honeycrisp. But that means you still got to thin off a substantial number of fruits. And one of the reasons we tend to like ATS or lime sulfur better, it actually knocks off some fruit as well as knock out seeds. But since the fruits aren't growing very much at full bloom, what the NAA does is kill seeds. But you've then now got to have a substantial petal fall response. And so that NAA bloom was great, but I still would want you to put on the 2 pints of carbaryl, and you can throw some NAA in there too if you want, on Honeycrisp in particular. Now, Will's comment about Regulate, I think anytime you have NAA in this cool weather, put Regulate with it on all varieties that you're going to put some NAA on. If you're not going to put NAA on, forget the Regulate because it's not really going to change the carbaryl uptake. Now, there's lots of little details I keep always forgetting to mention. The 7XLR formulation comes with a surfactant in it. I think it's soybean oil, but the company will never divulge it to me. But it has an inherent surfactant to help it be absorbed at maximum level. And so I like the 7XLR formulation on a year like this because you'll get the maximum amount of carbaryl into the plant. But the Regulate won't help it a bit if you're only putting on carbaryl. Does that make sense to you all?
Terrence, I got a question on that.
Yeah.
Are a lot of us are using the generic Carbaryl 4L. Do you know if that has a similar surfactant?
As far as we know, no.
Okay.
But this is one of my big complaints is that the companies will not divulge everything in their products. And I just am so frustrated with them. But as far as I know, it does not come loaded with that surfactant, which I think is soybean oil that comes in XLR.
Well, Terrence, I got another for you. Ever the optimist here. Should the weather pattern change and we can creep up into the 60s, for NAA, what would be the minimum temperature you'd like to see? 65? Is that where you want it to start to be at for some efficacy there?
Oh, if I could get low 60s, I'd be so happy this year. But I think low 60s is sort of 62-ish is where I'd think that NAA can do me a lot of good.
Okay. And for Maxell, not till we hit 70?
Yeah, it's 70.
Okay. Well, we'll hope for a warm swing.
Okay.
All right, anything else before we head out, folks? Well,
Well, good
not
luck,
seeing
everybody.
anything.
Nice to see you all.
All right, thank you, Terrence.
Thank you
And
so
we'll be
much.
back
These are
probably
really
sometime
helpful.
late next week.
Okay. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Have a good afternoon, folks.
Thanks.